an actress currently on Freeform's Grownish, and I'm so excited to be here with the Little Market today and their series. We are celebrating women around the world, all of our accomplishments, but also how far we still have to go. And with me today is a very, very dear friend of mine, Rebecca Bender. And I would give an entire introduction. I have a million things to say, but I'm going to turn to her because she is such a great speaker, and you will see in our time today. And I will let her do the introduction. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi, how are you? I'm so
Good.
excited to be here. Thanks for having us, and thanks, Little Market. We know that celebrating women really matters right now, and talking about where we've been from, where we've been through, and where we're heading is such a core message with all of these really important conversations that we're having. And I'm just excited to be here.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit of what you do and what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so today's topic, I wish I had a drum. We do the drum roll, right? But today we're going to talk about human trafficking. And as Francia said, my name is Rebecca Bender, and I'm a survivor of human trafficking. I was lured off of a college campus and trafficked for nearly 6 years until I was finally able to escape. And now I'm a recognized by the court of law subject matter expert on the issue of human trafficking. I train law enforcement, FBI, undercover cops, vice schools on how to identify and respond to exploitation. And we also have an online school for survivors of human trafficking. We have 866 women getting economic empowerment in 12 countries, spanning well over 400 US cities. So I'm really proud of the work we've done today, but I'm one of many survivor leaders that are trying to do things all across the globe to really talk about this issue and make sure that people know that your voice matters, our voice matters. We've all been through something. Just when you can take what you've been through and come back to help other women, that we see change.
And this is why I have Rebecca do the introductions, because you speak so well. So Rebecca and I met at a gala. She came up to me super pregnant and she said, your TV show, The Secret Life of the American Teenager, got me through breastfeeding in the middle of the night. So we started talking and then happened to sit next to each other. And she told me her story of surviving human trafficking. And what was interesting about your story, Rebecca, is when I thought of human trafficking, I always pictured a child locked up in a storage room on chains, and their trafficker comes to them whenever they feel like it and then put them out there. That's what I pictured. But in our conversation, you had told me, no, that's not what trafficking is. And you gave me an in-depth explanation of what it really is. So can you tell us can you actually tell everyone what you told me and the misconception behind it?
It's so true. And that misconception of human trafficking is, that's what we think as survivors. I think what's so important for people to realize is that survivors in the middle of their victimization of trafficking, we grew up in the same culture as all of you. So we're also picturing those movie scenes, and we're also picturing, the stranger danger white minivan being locked in a basement. And when the coercive, fraudulent components of our quote unquote relationship with the trafficker aren't matching those sensationalized kind of Hollywood scenes, we think we must not be being trafficked because I'm not held in a basement. And then we don't ask for help. We start to self-blame, and it becomes this vicious cycle. And so, everyone has those misconceptions, survivors included. And that's why it's so important to do these kind of conversations so we can really dive in, because we want to help people know what to look for, how to keep themselves safe, how to keep the people they love safe, and how to be a really great activist to support vulnerable populations that are being targeted. One of the things I think that's great to know in just talking about trafficking from a legal framework, it's basically the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Most of us only picture the force because that's what makes for really good headlines. But the fraud and coercion are used just as much, if not more, in that recruitment and that grooming. When you first meet someone, it's very rarely, less than 1% actually, according to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, are kidnapped. It starts with a promise, a false sense of a job, false sense of security. It starts with the promise of food or shelter or love. And then once you are lured away and secluded is generally when coercion and force begin after that.
So when you say grooming, can you explain a little bit about what grooming means and what that looks like so someone can identify that?
Yeah, grooming is when any predator is trying to exploit somebody's vulnerability, but they first get to know them, right? They're getting to know their hopes and their dreams, and then they're showing all of this possibility that could meet those hopes and dreams or fill that gap that they're having in their life, whether it's shelter, food, again, relationship, love, belonging. On in the U.S., average person that gets involved in human trafficking, 70% are actually come out of foster care, and so you're talking about huge vulnerabilities in really at-risk, marginalized groups. And so grooming, it begins to get to know you, create this false sense of trust, begin expanding your boundaries. I think we've seen this in high profile cases like Epstein. We've seen where the grooming of the victim, it's like, well, we start with just something small and see how that victim responds. And if they freeze, the predator pushes in more. And so it's small, gradual increase in trust and expansion of boundaries.
Is that what happened to you? Because you had mentioned in your introduction that you met your trafficker when you were in college.
Yeah, I grew up as a normal kind of all-American small town girl. I, played varsity sports. I was a cheerleader and a soccer player. I still had vulnerabilities. My parents divorced when I was young. It was a really ugly divorce, a lot of violence in the home because of that. So just a little bit desensitized to violence. But by the time I got to high school, I would have never been put in an at-risk youth category. I was, athlete and honor roll student. But I was also a party girl. I wanted to be a part of things. I would be the first one after a football game to jump in the back of a pickup truck and head to the bonfire with beer. Like, I wasn't this goody two shoes. I definitely had already, been the yes girl in lots of areas of my life because I had a deep wound from my parents' divorce that I wanted to love and be loved. And I think a lot of us can relate with that feeling of being young and impressionable and wanting to be a part of something. And so I had been accepted into university and had my dorm room assigned. And that summer I got pregnant. And I decided to unenroll from the university and go to community college with my daughter. But I quickly learned that being the girl on campus with the kid created all sorts of insecurities in me. But I was still in poverty, trying to be a single mom at 18, trying to put myself through school. And I realize now, looking back, that I was targeted because of that it wasn't my choice and I wasn't going to take the blame for some predator pretending to be someone he was not and picking out me specifically. And I think that's what's so common, regardless of what culture, community, trafficking happens all over the world. And how it looks in Cambodia is going to be different than how it looks in Nigeria, than it does in New York and Brooklyn, than it does in Manassas, Massachusetts. Like, it looks really different based on where you live. But regardless of the type of trafficking and the type of predatory tactics, the number one factor is that traffickers target vulnerable people.
Wow. I want to touch on that a little bit, and then I have a couple other questions for you. But because I know you and I know your story, your trafficker initially was your boyfriend, right?
Well, I thought he was my boyfriend. Come to find out he wasn't the age he said he was. He didn't have the job he said he had. It makes you wonder if when he said, I like peanut butter too, I'm just, as an example, did he really? Or was he just a chameleon to become the person that I was wanting my whole life, And so that's what traffickers do. And so I thought, in my mind, I thought he was my boyfriend.
Wow. And so, you're in school, he convinces you to leave school and you go to Vegas with him. And then how did it transition from let's start a life together in Vegas to you have to go sleep with that person and get money?
Yeah, my trafficker, well, he told me his job was relocating him to Las Vegas. And I thought, every good woman follows her man kind of thought that had been, I think, culture shaped for me as a young person. And you don't think about human trafficking as someone that loves you. You think, I was taught stranger danger. Look out for the white minivan and the guy that's offering you puppy and a candy. And I wasn't taught how to see when someone was starting to brainwash me, when trauma bonding was starting to take place. I wasn't taught how to stand up for myself when I just felt uncomfortable or something's not right. You just kind of, you don't want to be the one in the room that's like, something's not right here, So I didn't learn those things, which now we talk to our kids and people a lot about, what do you do when you're at a party and something is happening that makes you uncomfortable? How do you just simply get out of the room then before you're into a really dangerous situation? So in my situation, yeah, he took me to Las Vegas because he told me his job was relocating him, and so I wanted to go. I can actually remember him saying, "Families don't live in Vegas," and I thought he thinks we're a family, and so
Wow.
I begged to go. I think that's a really different scenario and moment. I can remember right where we were in the living room of my little apartment in Eugene, Oregon. And it's just this very different setting than someone being kidnapped in a parking lot, right? Is this moment of this predator leaning in and saying, families don't live in Vegas. And I'm thinking, no, I want to go. And you think we're a family. And finally, my daughter's going to have, the home that I think Broken Me always wanted. And so I got on the plane, quote unquote, willingly. I didn't realize that fraud at point of recruitment is actually a legal thing we look for when building cases.
Wow. And that's what you mean by vulnerable people, because as you stated earlier, coming from a broken home, all you wanted was love and family. And he used that word is family, which was a trigger. And I just wanted you to talk about that. So just to kind of show what vulnerability can look like, it is different for everyone. So tell me if you don't know the numbers, but percentage wise, statistically, how many women or children are brought in that way?
I mean, anytime we're working with different cases or women that we serve in our program, it's so common to see traffickers use false sense of security and target and exploit whatever it is that's going on in their life. Trafficking is one of the largest growing criminal enterprises in the world. It's surpassing the sale of guns. It's second only to drugs. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Sex for sale is rampant like never before. And if we think that predators aren't going to try to get a slice of that pie, then we're being naive. And I think with trafficked victims, there's so many marginalized communities at risk: women of color, brown and black girls, trans, non-binary. Homeless youth are targeted consistently. Anyone who fits a really high ACEs, which it stands for adverse childhood experiences, are really, really desensitized to violence in the home if you grew up in an abusive home. So there's so many vulnerabilities at play: poverty, mental illness, parents with substance abuse. This creates this vulnerable population in so many sectors that traffickers target. They are purposefully targeting vulnerable groups to try to get a slice of that billion-dollar pie.
Okay, so you mentioned the stigma behind, being trafficked, and and you've said, I was kind of blamed for it. You didn't say those words, but people were blaming you, right? So you come out of it, you have a daughter. What made you so brave to speak up?
It took me a really long time to come forward with my story. And, one of the things I think also that people don't realize is that trafficked victims, you don't self-identify as trafficked for a long time. It actually takes quite a long time for people to what we call outcry. And it's because of victim blaming. We self-blame. There's so many stigmas around, trafficking. So it's really important that we help people to break some of those, to have these really vulnerable and transparent conversations about the difficulties of coming forward. When you leave trafficking, there's all these barriers to reentry. I'm now running for my life. I have a 9-year-old little girl in tow. I have no job history. I have a criminal record. The federal case is pending. I'm now getting on food stamps, sleeping on couches, and I have a huge amount of PTSD. I mean, during my 6 years of being trafficked, I was traded and sold between 3 different traffickers. I have had 2 of them tattooed their names on my back, branded like a piece of cattle. I have had my face broken in multiple places, was hospitalized for dehydration and overexhaustion. The amount of trauma that I had, I just wanted to die. And for a long time, you're just so guarded. You don't realize how much trauma affects your brain. and the neurology of trauma. You and I have had conversations about, and pockets of memory that you don't remember, and then people question, and you're like, when you learn about it, you realize that's actually how the brain and trauma works. Is it's a Swiss cheese brain is a protective mechanism your brain does. It doesn't mean that you don't remember it didn't happen. It's actually a sign of trauma. But how do you work through that, and how do you create a place where you're not going back to the same vulnerabilities that got you trafficked in the first place? And now they're compounded with all of these other issues and still the same starting vulnerabilities. And that's why, I love what the Little Market is doing with their sustainable economic empowerment program and all of the incredible products they have on their side, and the way they're empowering survivors to get jobs and to figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your life, can be really scary if you don't have a community to support you.
Okay, Rebecca, you said Swiss cheese brain, which I'm glad you said that because I just learned what that was the other day from you. Can you please explain what that is?
Swiss cheese brain is kind of like if your brain, if you've ever heard of the hand model, I know you and I have, but just for everyone listening, right? If you're, let's say, in your room and you hear a glass break, your amygdala goes off. What's going on? What's happening? And if your cognitive reasoning part of your brain will have you think, oh, I left a glass on the table, I own a cat, I don't hear any footprints, and your brain settles back down and you go back to sleep. But let's say you hear the glass break and you don't own any cats, you live alone, and suddenly you start to hear footsteps. Your brain is now firing all cylinders and you go into fight, flight, or freeze. Let's say after that, something bad happens to you. Your brain will actually sometimes then just shut off to be able to deal with the trauma. And so later on, when you might be being interviewed, you don't remember what they were wearing or what they smelled like, or varying details that might assist in an investigation. And for a long time, people would think they were lying. And we're so grateful to do the work we do today to talk about trauma-informed interviewing, because Swiss cheese brain, parts of that parasympathetic mode that shuts down, is actually a sign that something happened and your brain was trying to protect itself. It's not a sign that it didn't happen. It's a sign that actually trauma occurred.
And is there a way to reaccess or integrate that part of your brain?
Yeah, there's actually really great specialized treatment for complex compound trauma or polyvictimization trauma. There's some EMDR is a really great therapeutic modality that helps people unlock memories and move them to the other side of the brain to be able to process. There's a variety of different therapeutic modalities that assist with this specialized type of trauma, which is also why I'm such a big fan and supporter of specialized services, because we would do that in the medical community. If you were diagnosed with cancer, you wouldn't go to a pediatrician. You'd go to a specialist. And we've got to start thinking about our mental health with that same, example in mind. We have to find therapists that specialize in the types of trauma that people go through. And human trafficking victims are no different. Complex compound trauma is a really different, distinct type of trauma that takes specialized care.
That is so fascinating. And just to reiterate, this isn't just with trafficked victims. This is worldwide. This is with any human being with any type of trauma. And I'm so glad that it's now being looked at. My next question is, anti-human trafficking organization, they often say that trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. What does that even mean?
Yeah, I love this question. And we say that a lot. What we mean by that is human trafficking touches all different sectors of mental health and marginalized populations and different crimes. When you have trafficking, usually the vulnerability, the on-ramp to exploitation that's taken place is desensitized in the home to domestic violence, someone coming out of the foster care pipeline, poverty. And so you're having all of these other areas that if you want to really fight trafficking, it's not just about rescuing the one, right? It's about let's look at our foster care system. Let's talk about how to end poverty and homelessness and how to support the LGBTQ youth in our community that feel like they don't have a safe place to go. That's all these other intersectionalities that then sometimes lead to exploitation. And then in exploitation, criminal activity can take place. What feels like domestic violence, drug addiction, substance abuse, criminal records. And so then you have all these touch points where we can really assist to come alongside and support victims that are trying to escape exploitation and human trafficking. And then, of course, the off-ramps when you're actually trying to rebuild your life, and all of those barriers that exist when you are trying to navigate this new world that I know I've said before, but it's like I'm trying to navigate this world I know nothing about. I don't know how to access community support. My trafficker didn't teach me what was out in the community as resources. Of course not. They're trying to keep you completely dependent on them. You have no clue where to look for help, where to go. I actually can remember calling a domestic violence helpline. I didn't even know that I was being trafficked. And so when we say it's not in a vacuum, it means that all of these other areas that as social justice activists we should be looking at and we should be collaborating on and coming around and supporting one another, because sometimes we're all serving the same client and we might just not know it.
At what point did you realize you were being trafficked? Because I know that you had already left your trafficker for a while and it still hadn't clicked. So at what point, and when you came to that realization, what did you do to help your trauma?
When I was first, when I was being trafficked, I ended up getting addicted to drugs. I was a full blown addict by 21. And my trafficker had convinced me that it was because of the drugs that he kept having to do this. And so at first it was, we're going to pay back the move. And then it was, well, now because of your drug use. And so he convinced me to go to rehab, and he actually paid for rehab. Really, I'm confident it was because he wanted to keep his product sellable. And so I had this short stint away from him where I was able to get clean, and I'm so grateful today. 18 years clean and sober. My family took my daughter from me because of that. It was really hard losing your baby and just having all of these really hard things. How do you navigate a child welfare systems, right? These are all these intersectionalities that traffic victims face every single day, that it's not just so easy to run. You're talking about, I mean, other things like gang trafficking. Gangs use a very different type of coercive behavior to keep victims in compliance. And so there's actually 25 different types of human trafficking that exist. And if we're only picturing one and thinking of one, we're going to literally miss 24 other forms of trafficking that are taking place in our very own communities every single day. So that feeling of trying to finally get out and navigate it all and get community support and therapy and education and working a minimum wage job and getting on food stamps and finally getting my first raise because I did great at my job, and realizing that a $50 raise cut $150 off of my food stamps. And so it just felt like, how do I dig myself out of this pit? This doesn't feel like freedom. This feels equally as crappy. Because it's this hopelessness that still exists. And that's why I just love partnering with so many groups that focus on that, after that, trying to rebuild, trying to figure out how you're going to support yourself and be really truly empowered and self-sustaining. And it feels really exciting when things are starting to come together. And it takes a while. I think I was 2 years into my current marriage. I've been married 11 years. I was 2 years in until I really started seeing myself as a trafficked victim. I thought for a long time I was just a prostitute and my boyfriend beat me. And I took the blame of being an addict and just thought it was all my bad choices. And, I got on the plane that day. It wasn't until I actually watched a documentary that it made my brain click, that I was like, wait a minute, fraud is a part of trafficking. And when I started really understanding the law of like force, fraud, or coercion to transport, harbor, solicit, patronize by means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex. So act means purpose. That's what we look for when we're helping people. And as a young person who's been through a huge amount of trauma, I'm not thinking, well, I think due to the vulnerabilities and the fraudulent behavior of my exploiter, maybe you're not thinking. That's actually the professional's job. We just want to hear what happened. How did you meet that person? What did they say? And we should, as the community and as the experts and as the social service providers, it's our responsibility. It's not the child's, it's not the victim's, it's ours to say, you know what? I don't think that was you, and you shouldn't carry that blame. The predator did that to you, and that's not yours to carry. And you believed someone that you trusted. And they pretended to be someone you could trust. And so we've got to start, I think, having these conversations, because not only all the intersectionalities and the vulnerabilities and the off ramps, but it's also about, helping to really break stigmas and to not just talk about the kidnapped scene, because we're going to lose and we're not going to see hundreds of victims that are standing at bus stops right now with someone pretending to give them a ride. And that person is a predator. They have very different plans. These conversations are crucial to start opening eyes.
And talking about recovering, what kind of interventions have proven helpful for survivors?
Some of the interventions that have been proven helpful are really specialized services. University of Northern Colorado and a group called the Avery Center actually put out a really incredible study recently that shows that domestic human trafficking here in the US fits every single indicator of cult-like behavior. So you're having these groups with a high control group leader that are replacing your ideologies with new sets of ideologies. You're being rewarded for cooperation and you're being punished for non-cooperation. Now there's 15 to 18 different indicators of a cult, what one would be able to deem as a cult. And when you think about it from that perspective, that creates a whole different set of support. How would you support someone trying to get out of a cult that's dealing with survivor guilt, that feels like, but I left other girls behind? Or, but what's going to happen to them? Or the really twisted parts in your brain that feel like, why does part of me miss the family, like the whole group of us? I had 3 other women that was in the home where I was trafficked and 1 other child. So there's 4 women and 2 children. And I can remember running and thinking, will I ever see my best friend again? Will I ever know what happens to that little boy? And that's part of what keeps you for far too long.
Rebecca, you said something interesting earlier, and it's a conversation that we've had. And when you first told me your story, I'm not going to lie to you, same thing ran through my mind. And you said earlier, I'm just a prostitute. I asked for this. And when I learned about your story 8 years ago, and I learned that you weren't locked up in a room, you were in a very nice home, and you would leave to go to work, which was, being trafficked, and then come back. And you said that often you're asked, why didn't you leave? And told you're just a prostitute. So for anyone else who's being trafficked and maybe not realizing that that's what's happening, what's your response to that? And can you just kind of go into detail with all of that?
Yeah, everyone asks that. Why didn't you just run? And why didn't you just grab a grenade, bomb the hotel, jump out the window and run for freedom? And you're like, this isn't the movies. It doesn't work like that in real life. But usually my answer is I did run. That's why I'm standing here. I did run. Why didn't I run sooner? I had multiple attempted escapes, and I learned what to do better each time. I learned that post 9/11, you can't buy a plane ticket with cash. And because I got all the way to the airport and they wouldn't sell me a ticket, my trafficker didn't leave me a debit card. Even though you physically can come and go, it's with his permission, it's with the amount of time you're allowed to be gone. And it's after you've shown a certain amount of trust that comes from actually being brainwashed and traumatized. It's not because, it's because you're finally complying to the rules. I can remember being at the grocery store. I was given 45 minutes to go to the grocery store, and 45 minutes hit and my phone rang. And I can remember he said, "Where are you?" And I said, I'm on my way home. And he said, "Turn on the radio, honk the horn." And I can remember holding out the phone and the clicker, beep, 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 because I was in the parking lot. And I can remember him just saying, "Oh, so you're lying. Let's see what happens to lying girls when you get home." And it's just that constant, it's no matter where you are, you're always being watched or timed, and you start to feel like you're going crazy a little. And you're young, you're 19 and you're vulnerable. And I know I'm sharing from my one personal experience, but we've served almost 900 women in 6 years. And my story is not unique. This is what happens. And even if people can't relate with the trafficking component, I think there's a lot of people that can identify with feeling trapped in a bad relationship, trapped in a dead-end job, having had their boundaries pushed at a party that they're embarrassed of, making a decision that felt like, I regret that every day. I think all of us as women especially have had moments like that. And when we realize that we're a lot more alike than we are different, we can build community to support one another's growth and encourage you to say, you're more than your story. That was not your fault. You had someone that was influencing you. you can do this, you can move on to.
And speaking on that, you just said that you've helped over 900 women. You said we have helped. And the last sentence you said, I'm always telling these women that. And that happened because you started an academy called Elevate. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I finally ran from my trafficker, I lived in a community where no services existed. I ran right back home to my small farm town and just tried to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And there was no drop-in center, there was no specialized trauma-informed therapy. There wasn't, those types of things didn't exist. And I was going back to school online at night and having to take online classes because there wasn't any universities there. And it hit me one day, if I can get a master's online, I can mentor online. And I couldn't possibly be the only survivor who lived in a community where services didn't exist. So I replicated what my university was doing. I wrote a 16-week curriculum. And at first I just put it out on Facebook, started to invite other survivors, because I'd already been sharing my story as a trainer, but I hadn't started any direct mentoring. And we started with 5 women 6 years ago. And now, yeah, we have almost 866 women this month, spanning over 400 US cities. It's just crazy to think in 6 years pre-COVID that we did everything online and got them classes and mentors and coaches, partnered them with other business women out there. If you want to start an Etsy shop, we want to partner you with someone that knows how, and just trying to leverage our network to be able to help women figure out what they want to do with the rest of their lives.
That's so beautiful. And I think it's such a beautiful testimony of how your story doesn't define you. Like, you're walking proof of that. Now you're talking about your story as past tense, but look at everything you've done. And I was going to ask about COVID actually, so I'm glad you said that. How has that impacted your work?
Oh, COVID's impacted everybody. I mean, the commercial, for sex trafficking specifically, the commercial sex industry has been impacted, from COVID too. But what we've seen with victims of trafficking is that everything has moved online. That's why we're seeing an increase in webcams, an increase in pornography. This is something that I think we're not talking about because it can feel uncomfortable. But to think of how many traffickers are now forcing their victims to make videos because street hotels aren't as nearly open in varying states. People have the fear of catching COVID, and so street exploitation had died down for a while during COVID. So online exploitation is rampant right now because of COVID, and just because you don't see someone on the other side of the camera threatening that victim doesn't mean that they don't have an exploiter. And so we need to, we're going to have to all start to be really thoughtful of how we're going to support people who have been trafficked through an online exploitation, channel.
So then how does that give you hope?
I think
Go
what gives me hope is that we see so much resiliency in humanity, right? That we see people that have been through so much and have turned it around to help make a difference and to change laws and to build structures and to create companies that support. A lot of that comes out of our own lived experience, and might not be trafficking, like I said, but it's birthed out of that feeling of, I don't want any teenage girl to feel like they've got to send a sexy selfie in order to feel value. How do we tackle all these intersectionalities? And I think we're seeing so much great community support that's been birthed out of really hardship from one another, that resiliency is saying all of this can't have been for nothing. And then you fight to create something greater than before. And so that inspires me when I see people do that every day. We can make a change. We can make a change in our world to not exploit each other.
I mean, I could talk to you for hours. I hope, I wish the world would be in on our conversations. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and educating us on the stigma behind human trafficking, what it really looks like. And I hope you all really took something from all of this. And I want to thank you, Rebecca, for all of the work that you've been doing for the last 8 years. Has it been 6 years?
I've been doing this work for 13 years. My school's 6 years old, but been writing books and sharing my story and training law enforcement for almost 13 years now. Really just trying to sound the alarm and doing my part and what I can. I think when we look at the issue of smoking, for example, 30 years ago, your flight attendant would offer you a cigarette and it would be normal. Or your doctor would walk in your room smoking and you'd think it was normal. And we've seen the way a community health crisis has made a change, but it took everybody doing something. It took lawyers, suing big tobacco. It took media. It took everything. And I think we can do the same for exploitation. We need people in this, not just a flash in the pan, but the long haul. And, Francia, you have been in this for the long haul. You have been a human trafficking activist and advocate, fighting for women and vulnerable groups for a very long time. And I personally want to say thank you, because you're not someone that just comes in and leaves, but you're in this because it's going to take some time to change, make a real difference in changing culture. What makes you so passionate about doing this? Can I ask that? Can we flip our interview for a minute?
Girl, honestly, when I first started hearing about this one, I was shocked and I was like, there's no way slavery doesn't exist anymore. And when I was taught that this is modern day slavery, it just blew my mind. And then hearing your story and even hearing it now, this industry, we're very vulnerable. And I've seen vulnerable people, myself included, kind of being lured into certain situations. And I felt like I had to do something about it. And thank you for saying that, because I don't feel like I'm doing enough. But this conversation in itself, knowing that maybe someone's watching that's saying, oh my gosh, that might be me, is probably the biggest reward that I could, receive. So my passion lies behind vulnerable communities, especially when you talked about undocumented people, and being in those situations myself. And fortunately, I was around people that held me back. And and this could happen to anyone. And I really hate that it happens to children as young as 4 years old and little boys as young as 4 years old. So that's where my passion lies. And again, I want to thank you for coming on here, for telling your story, for being so brave in the details, because I know that's tough. It's never easy. And just everything you're doing, and the Little Market for everything that you're doing and allowing us to come on here and share all of this with you all. So thank you so much.
These conversations matter. So yes, thank you, Little Market, for talking about something that's so important, because it looks really different in all over. So yeah.
It does. And you know what? I'm glad that you used the cigarette example, because it took a while for people to understand how unhealthy that was. And I think we're on that path now with human trafficking. It wasn't a conversation that existed 6 years ago, and it's a slow process, but I think we're getting there. And you're one of the humans that, is helping making that happen. So
yeah. It takes all of us doing our part, because it's so many ways to fight this, whether it's an on-ramp, a during, or an exit ramp. And I love what the Little Market is doing with helping women create sustainable livings, because that's a huge barrier. You're really tempted to go back if you don't have a way to support yourself. And so it's just go check out their website, check out their products. They have so many great, beautiful, incredible things, all made by survivors. Help people and women like me that are trying to get a fresh start and are trying to rebuild their lives again. Go check them out, check out their website.
And I'll celebrate. We've come far, but there's, we can go, us women, we can go so much further. So anyway, that's my time. Thank you so much for coming on, Rebecca.